Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Forward Thinking Podcast. We have a special CS2 guest with us today, Alison Rouse. Welcome, Alison.
Hi, great to be on the podcast again.
And of course, we have Charlie, per usual. And today we're going to tackle a topic close to our hearts, and it's attribution. And we want to talk about the right way to go about attribution. Attribution gets a lot of hate on LinkedIn or across, B2B marketing folks and Slack channels, and anywhere you can find, there'll be a heated conversation around attribution. And there are ways you can go wrong with attribution, and that might even be starting with how you define it. But we want to tackle what's the right way to go about attribution. And Alison's going to share her wealth of knowledge. She has a background working at Full Circle Insights and helps manage a lot of our measurement and marketing reporting projects here at CS2. So should we just dive into it?
Let's do it.
All right. So Alison, you want to take us through first, what is attribution? What's the definition of attribution?
The way I like to think about it is just kind of looking at all the touch points along a customer journey that led to the purchase of your product and assigning credit to each of those touches. And obviously there's multiple models that assign different values depending on the model that you're looking at. You might have heavier weight given to certain touches along that journey, but really it's about understanding what led to the purchase and assigning credit to those touches.
In terms of the definition, one thing I'd love to get more of your opinion on is, because I think a lot of times when people hear attribution, they instantly think of the most complicated form of attribution, because that's what's being sold to them generally by some of these vendors, like multi-touch attribution, W-shaped model, machine learning models, and all of this kind of stuff. But attribution can also be simple for companies at an early stage in their maturity and analytics. Can you explain the scale or the scope of attribution and where it can start and where it can get complicated, like both ends of the spectrum?
Yeah, I think, and we often recommend this to our clients starting out, is knowing where the acquisition point of the folks that are coming into your database, the lead source, where they came from. And then if you want to get even a little bit more complicated, knowing, their most recent lead source, so what they just did, and tracking that all the way to the opportunity is a really simple way of understanding, what touches are influencing your deals. It's definitely not comprehensive of everything because there's obviously things that happen in between. So like one step up from that could be even just using the out-of-the-box Salesforce campaign influence reporting. That's not going to assign, like if you have $100 opportunity, it's not going to assign that $100 across the campaigns, but it is going to tell you what campaigns influence that deal. So you can at least do some analysis on volume. And then, even more complicated, you could get a tool like a Visible or Full Circle Insights or Lean Data Attribution, where you're splitting that dollar amount across touches. And, there's models where you could just do an even spread across all the touches, or you could give greater influence to the first touch or the last touch. And then even more complicated, you could start getting into statistical analysis, like doing regression or Bayesian models. But for that, at least in my opinion, it feels like you would need to have a lot of volume to really determine or to discern a pattern. But I think there's still, even if you don't have that kind of volume, there's still a lot of value you can get from a model, whether it's that simple lead source model or a little bit more sophisticated multi-touch model.
Yeah. And I think related to that, so you've been talking about this kind of internally with us, and then you put it out, something out there on LinkedIn recently. about where people go wrong with attribution, and you just articulated it in this perfect way. So I'd love to to articulate that here. Like, where do people go wrong with attribution, and like what is the we're going to get into the right way in a bit, but actually let's just start with the wrong. Like, what are people doing wrong when it comes to attribution?
Yeah, I think so. The thing that I posted on LinkedIn is that oftentimes marketers will try to use the data to prove that what they're doing is working, rather than using it to improve what they're doing and making sure it's working better over time and optimizing. I think people often forget that an attribution model is a model, and thus it's not, definitive, it's directional. There's a famous quote by a statistician, George Box, that says all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that we really need to remember that when we're looking at the data, that it's not definitive. If the model says this campaign brought in, $100,000 in revenue, like that's not the truth. But if you compare that with another campaign, maybe you can determine which one's performing better.
Yeah. So then marketers that are looking for that definitive answer, what do you have to say to them? Like, if they're saying, I just feel like I need to know like 100% what's working, what's not working. And I want my report just to literally just like, tell me what to do, like without any thinking. Because what you're saying, it requires, more thought and interpretation and analysis and context. And, but that's kind of where the fun part comes in, where you can try and bring that stuff in. Right. But I'd love to hear, like from you, because I still believe there's value in having that directional information, but how would you go about having that conversation with a marketer that, doesn't believe or struggles with just getting to the level of being able to use directional information because they just need this binary, just like 100%, this is exactly what you need to do?
Yeah, well, and first I would encourage them to even think about some of their own complex purchases that they've made, like if they've ever bought a car or some big investment where they had to do a lot of research, and think about all the touch points that, marketing wise or others that they had along that journey. And remember that their customers are going through something similar, that it's not just a magic bullet where, you're going to find the golden campaign that leads to all the close won deals. But there are definitely ways that you can look at the data to see what channels are working better, which campaigns within those channels are working better. And I think it's all about making sure that when you are looking at the data, that you're using it as a comparison tool, and that you're using it to evaluate similar campaigns or similar channels. I also really encourage people to have a hypothesis about what they expect to see in the data, and then use the data to prove that hypothesis. So if you feel, of all the events you did this year, event A was the best event, well, let's look at the data and see, was it the best event?
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit more about what we were talking about before we jumped on, around the users and the stakeholders who are going to be mostly using this data? Because I know you've got an opinion on what level that should be at in terms of the organization hierarchy.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the whole prove and improve things. I do feel that there's some sort of kind of a need for the marketer to present this information to other teams or executives, to show that, these investments I made are leading to this amount of revenue or increasing the pipeline by this amount. When really it's in my mind, attribution's a practitioner's tool set, where they're looking at all kind of the landscape of things that they've done over the last year, whatever your time frame is, and kind of figuring out which of those things move the needle more than some of the other things, and then repeating that by doing similar things and maybe stopping doing some other things and being more scientific about and experimental with their campaigns going forward based on that data-driven approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I talked about before this call was a lot of the time people look to attribution reporting as kind of like their marriage counselor per se, like between sales and marketing. We're going to have more alignment because sales is finally going to understand our impact and what we're doing and how that affects their deals. But there's a lot of things wrong with that because it's not, that silver bullet. Also, a lot of these models might not even take into consideration sales touches. And so if you're talking or including a person who's leading that team, they're going to feel a bit like, defensive. Well, what about what my team's doing? And I know other tools are letting you include those touches and you do the work, but a lot of time they aren't. And so if anything, it starts to have this this fight between like proving our worth when in the end, you have your revenue goal that you just want to see up and to the right. You're reporting on revenue. So yeah, I feel like a lot of time marketers are looking to ways to prove their worth, and maybe because we have that anxiety of needing to do that, but really, if you're using it to improve, if anything, your results are going to be better. And then the conversation with your executive team is more around the, overall impact that you made from making these changes. You're able to make quick changes or invest in the right places, and they'll see the results just in the data. And then I think another thing that you mentioned before too, Alison, was just around timing. And this might go into something that people do wrong, but when you are using this data to prove, like you said, sometimes you just need time for attribution models to work. And I always think of the people who are like on like a weight loss program or something, and then they do one workout and then they weigh themselves after and try, right after just doing that one workout, you're not likely going to see much change, right? You haven't done the work, or there haven't been enough time to see change. And that's another thing to keep in mind too for marketers, because they think, oh, we ran these programs this quarter, let's report on those. Why are they not showing up in our attribution reports? And it's like, well, you know how long your cycle is or how long it's create opportunities. And I think the timing part, like you've mentioned before, can get in that way too, of proving instead of improving.
Yeah, completely agree. I think attribution, I always talk about leading and lagging indicators when it comes to marketing, and attribution is definitely more on the lagging indicator.
Yeah.
If you really need to look at program success before, for the campaigns you run this quarter, attribution is not going to answer that necessarily. Depends on your sales cycle, because the seeds you're planting this quarter aren't going to show up in your pipeline or your revenue until a future quarter. So if you're needing to look at, earlier on, what are the leading indicators of success, definitely that's where your volume, your lead source is going to be helpful. If you're doing ABM, just kind of looking at overall engagement at your accounts. Those kinds of things, but attribution is definitely more of a lagging indicator. So don't get discouraged when you don't see high numbers on those campaigns you launched last month. Definitely take that into consideration when you're looking at the metrics, and give it time.
So then one question I have is around, for the practitioners who are, rolling up into the VPs and the CMO, and there's one person who's running paid ads, there's one person doing content, or one person doing their demand gen programs, whatever. And they're all kind of trying to ask for more budget. And attribution, right? Like, you're able to have a much more clearer picture of everything that's going on when you have multi-touch attribution and you're not just looking at like single touch, like a first touch, because that might, there might be touch points that never show up in a first touch model, right? Because they always require like already having the data to be able to run that program. So multi-touch gives you more of the picture, but then it adds on like complexity, right? And then you have this, model that's showing you what's working, what's not working. And I'd love to get your opinion on how do you translate all of that into a clear message to the executive leadership team when you're trying to get more budget and to give them confidence that you're going to use that budget wisely, right? And I'm sure it comes down to things like, you've been improving your impact, so you've learned about what's working, so then when you ask for the budget, you can like tell them, this is what I'm going to put it in because I've been learning about what's working and this is the different areas I'm going to put it in. But love to get your thoughts on how you communicate attribution to executives that might not really understand it as much, or may may just really need to know, like the need to be given confidence that you're not just going to waste that budget, right? Based on, and you bring data to the table.
Yeah, I think one way is to look at a couple really important deals and kind of dissect those and look at the attribution for those really large deals that were brought in and show them that the journey that someone took, and then kind of extrapolate that more broadly and show how those same touch points that led to this deal is leading to other deals. And I guess kind of going back to even the question about what people do wrong with attribution is that there is a very heavy focus on volume. Even the attribution vendors, a lot of their out of the box reporting is focused on volume. Like these channels brought in this amount of revenue or pipeline, or this number of opportunities was created or influenced by these channels. And despite the fact that there's many different ways you can do a model, my favorite model is actually an even spread model, not because it's accurate, remember it's a model, but it does give us the landscape of all the touches that led to a deal. And then we can start to weed out the bias of a model that like an even spread model where your highest volume campaign is going to show up as your most successful campaign if you're just looking at volume. But one thing that we encourage people to do with the attribution data is to look at other metrics aside from volume. So one example is conversion rate or win rate. So looking at all the opportunities that a particular channel or set of campaigns has influenced, and the percentage of those that were closed won. So if you have a really high volume campaign that's influenced most of your deals, that win rate is going to be somewhat low because it's influenced most of your deals. So it's going to reflect your overall win rate. Where you can see a more incremental impact is maybe some of your lower volume campaigns where they're still influencing a good amount of opportunities, but there's a higher likelihood of those opportunities closing. And so we often represent this with the scatter plot chart, where on the x-axis you have the volume of closed opportunities, and then on the y-axis you have your win rate. And then you're comparing your campaigns against each other, whether it's your channels themselves or individual campaigns within a channel. And so you can see your campaigns in the upper right quadrant are going to be the ones that were most impactful in terms of conversion rate. Remember, it's just one metric. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one area that, if you look at your large deals and you kind of bring it back to those types of reporting where you're looking at multiple metrics, and you are seeing that on average, this channel or this campaign is above average in terms of something like conversion rate, like that's a really powerful message that you should be investing more in that channel. And, you know, obviously you have the data to back it up. And that's one way in which you could, you know, try to get more budget for that channel.
Yeah. Yeah. We've kind of we've kind of dove right into the right way to do attribution. I think I was thinking like divide to do, like, I'm just messing up my words here. But, and that's, and I love that, like looking at the conversion rate and that lift, like what is the baseline average conversion rate? And if this channel touches an opportunity, does that improve the chances of close, right?
Yeah.
And is that improving the likelihood for a close one opportunity?
I also like that report because it brings the whole marketing team into that type of reporting. I think a lot of the time you do some like first touch reporting, and the field marketers or the teams that are focused on like deal acceleration are just completely left out, and they feel like their campaigns or their channels aren't effective, when really they are. It's just, if you're just looking at first touch, you're going to see a lot of like your website or paid or demos and stuff like that. So that type of report, and that's like, I could probably tie like 60% of people I've seen like really start distrusting attribution is because they went there first. Let's include the whole team, but then let's start looking at first touch attribution, or let's wait more to first touch. And then those teams are like, well, this makes my campaigns look like crap, or I don't see any representation of my campaigns. And then they are like, I don't trust that. I don't trust that reporting. And it creates this conflict. So I like that.
Yeah. And I love what you talk about with removing the bias to volume, because that definitely is like one of the big problems with attribution. Like and to talk about it in an extreme scenario, like if you have a business and say like 99% of their touch points are all, or maybe 90% of their touch points are all just like, I think you came up with this example yesterday, just like from an ebook, like this one ebook or something. Yeah. So like basically every opportunity that's ever happened has been influenced by that ebook. Now that doesn't mean that you should turn off everything apart from that ebook. But when you look at a chart like that, that's probably going to end up having a pretty low conversion rate because it's touched almost every opportunity, and therefore it's going to be touching a lot of lost opportunities. Whereas there could be something that is primarily, when that touch point is involved, it's only really influencing that deal to the point where it's influencing the deal positively enough that there's an improved win rate. So something that could have a much lower volume, and volume is still part of it, right? Because you still want to touch more, like if it's just one opportunity, it's probably not that useful either. So there's still a balance, but it definitely just strips away that bias, where you don't then end up optimizing for just the volume play, which I think is what a lot of people their issue with attribution, because it can lead you astray if you don't strip out bias like that. So I think it's a really important point to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, even at my last company, we had this research report that we did every year that was very popular with the community, and pretty much everyone in our database would download that report every year. And we even got into some heated discussions with some of our SDRs about whether we should MQL everybody who downloads that report, because they had some really good conversations with people who downloaded that report. When we're looking at the data, I'm like, I'm sure you've had some good conversations, but you also kind of need to think about the fact that everyone's downloading it, and the people that you haven't had good conversations with are also downloading it.
Yeah.
So, let's, be a little bit realistic. Let's look at, of the people that downloaded it, what audience generally leads to opportunity. So when I talk about attribution data too, I think another mistake people often make is not being specific enough about, what they're trying to measure against. One example that that I've seen is, some of the vendors, because they don't know the specific fields you use in your database, they're just going to give you an overall attribution report, but they're not going to have a dashboard that says, okay, let's just look at new business versus renewals versus upsell. Like, the journey is completely different for those opportunities. So you need to drill down a bit more. And maybe it's a different based on the audience. You might have tactics that are more effective for, a C-level executive type of audience versus practitioners. So making sure that when you're comparing campaigns, you're comparing it against, the original intent of that campaign. Was the intent to drive engagement with a practitioner audience or an executive audience? Was the intent to get people to renew or to upsell, or was the intent to drive new business? And really drilling in and segmenting based on that.
Yeah, and that's where some of your hypothesis can come into it, right? You can challenge them, test them, and see if the what you think was meant to happen, right, actually happened or not.
Yeah.
So you've talked about conversion rate. I know you've got a few others.
And
other
kind of
dimensions.
segmenting your opportunity types. If anyone's taking notes, I would say that's another key thing, is when you are running those dashboards or reports, maybe try and filter by, your new business versus renewal and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
That's another key takeaway I'm getting from Alison.
Yeah. And then I know, so if you've got other dimensions, I still can't stop thinking of that Prodigy song. But so let's go into the others. So you've talked about conversion rate, but are there any others that you like to use with attribution data?
Yeah, so kind of similar to conversion rate or win rate. What's also become really important is like deal velocity and just velocity. So we can run the same kind of report or scatter plot chart with velocity and let's look at all the closed won opportunities. So you have on your x-axis, you've got the number of closed won opportunities. In the middle is your scatter plot based on either campaign channel or type or individual tactic. And then on the y-axis is, all right, I think I got my axes confused, but on the other axis is the average number of days it took those opportunities to close. So your best campaigns or channels will be in the upper left quadrant of that scatter plot chart, where they're influencing a lot of closed won deals that close quickly. So that's another great one, especially if, as Chrissy mentioned, there are marketers who are more focused on acceleration. I even think of like the email channel as something that obviously you'll never see in a first touch report. But for somebody, maybe your marketing team that's building out your nurture campaigns, they want to know which nurture track is most successful for deal acceleration. That's perfect for that kind of comparison.
Totally. Yeah. Email is a big one. Like I think I posted on LinkedIn about this, but we made a big purchases. And like you said, it's buying a car. And one of the things that like just tipped me over was just an email about its safety rating. And I even responded back to them, just letting you know, this is what tipped me over to make the purchase, because they would never really know, or, or a lot of times that wouldn't show up in the reporting. And I feel like that's important for the marketers to know, but that can definitely have a huge role, but not get the credit where, in some of this reporting people are doing that. Yeah, it's a good point.
And definitely sped up that deal.
Yeah.
And then we bought the car like 3 days later.
Yeah.
And then we've got velocity, conversion. Is there any other dimensions that you would add on? I've got a few more questions as well, like before we wrap this up, but any other dimensions beyond those two?
Yeah, I'll talk about one more dimension and then I'll talk about another way to use the data. So the other dimension that we would generally look at maybe is average deal size. So especially if you're trying to increase the average deal size, maybe you're doing ABM and that's a goal. You might want to know what tactics are leading to larger deals. So you'll have, again, your scatter plot chart, you'll have your volume of closed won opportunities, and then you'll have your average deal size. And so your best campaigns or tactics will be in the upper right quadrant where they're influencing a lot of deals with a large average deal size. And then another way that I would use all three of these dimensions, so the win rate, the velocity, and the average deal size, is doing what I would call lift analysis, where, and this comes especially valuable if you're really wanting to hone in on a particular campaign or channel or tactic and want to know, did that channel or campaign or tactic have any incremental lift in terms of any one of those dimensions? So you'll look at what was the conversion rate or the win rate of this campaign for all the opportunities that it influenced. And then let's look at the opportunities that it didn't influence and look at that win rate. And is it better? It's somewhat of a scientific approach. Like I always like to think of it like a science experiment where you have your treatment group and your control group. It's not technically scientific because you're not intentionally applying that campaign to certain opportunities and not others, but it should directionally tell you whether or not it's better than the average.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of one thing I want to ask you before the end here, which is kind of like a different, it's switching gears a little bit, but it's around the invisible touch points, stuff that you can't track, because that's where I see people generally getting a little bit upset with attribution sometimes, because they say, oh, I'm doing this podcast or something, I'm not generating leads, I'm not able to track engagement. So then my attribution report is going to tell me that I shouldn't do podcasts anymore because it's not showing up in the report.
Yeah.
What do you, and then but then in my opinion, they kind of take it another step further and go, I shouldn't do any attribution, because it's not telling me everything. But then I know, there's a difference between, well, you don't need to get everything right in order to do anything. So I'd love to get your opinion on that, and what you would say to someone who's lost faith in attribution because they've heard people talk about that invisible touch point issue.
Yeah. Well, I guess, so one thing I would say about attribution in general is that I find it most valuable when you're comparing tactics within a channel as opposed to comparing channels against each other, just because it's like the variables are so different depending on the channel. Like I think directionally it's helpful to look at different channels and compare them against each other. But are you realistically going to stop a given channel? I mean, unless it's really performing poorly, what you really want to do is optimize your tactics within each channel to be the most, successful. So that's one side of it. Then the other side, with the touches that you're not able to track within attribution, yeah, that's always going to be a challenge. And that's where you can't really use attribution to, prove that it's working. Again, attribution is not about proving, it's about improving. So I would look at more leading indicators of success with some of those channels, like with the podcast, you can see how many views you get per episode. And that's kind of more of a leading indicator of success. You're not going to tie it directly to revenue, but again, because we're not always using attribution correctly and using it to prove rather than improve. If you're really wanting to use data to improve, your podcasts, for example, as an example, looking at the views over time and,
Which podcast did better than the other? Like, are your guests ones getting more views or the ones not? Yeah, like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Exactly.
what scares people also we've talked about ungating their content. And I think that comes up too. It's like, oh, well, how am I going to like measure or get, and like you said, the content has such high volume that, I mean, you kind of know it works top of funnel, right? And you could, but if you are able to track even just the downloads or even page visits, you can tie some implied attribution to say, okay, this piece of content did really well versus not. And that's really kind of what you just want to report on for content, like what's getting the most visibility and downloads, because it's really just about educating your buyer at that point.
Yeah,
So
and it's about improving, not
yeah.
proving. And if you extrapolate that mindset to everything, then it kind of answers all of the questions or the doubters, because you're not, if you're looking to prove your podcast is influencing revenue, then yeah, it's going to be hard to show that in an attribution report. And unless maybe you ask your contacts, like, do you listen to our podcast, and like add a field on the contact, like they're a podcast listener or something like that, which I mean, you could totally do. But when it comes to improving, if you're constantly just trying to improve, then that is, you're looking at it through these different lenses and trying to improve things independent of each other. So it's not like, oh, because I'm trying to improve my, paid ads, I'm going to stop doing a podcast. That doesn't lead to that decision, right? Because you're just trying to improve your paid ads and look at the data, what's working, what's not working across those 3 dimensions and other things. So I think if you just put that prove concept at the beginning of everything, it just smooths out any of the issues and any of the complications for people, I think. One last question on attribution is, so we've talked about the dimensions that you can look at from the conversion, etc. Now, one thing that a lot of people talk about is attribution models, and you mentioned a linear model where touch point, the calculation is just evenly spread across all of the individual touch points. Then there's like W-shaped models and all that other stuff. Now, what is your opinion on, I know you prefer the linear model, but what are some of the pros and cons of some of the other models from your point of view, like W-shape or U-shape or any of the others?
Yeah, and I think that you can use those models to answer different questions. The reason I like the even spread model is that it allows me to pull those scatter plot charts that I just mentioned, because I'm giving even amount of credit to everything. I just find it hard, like kind of going back to like thinking about a big purchase that you've made, thinking about giving one touch point more credit than another just based on the order in which I did that, just doesn't sit right with me too much. It's really challenging to see that that's what's driving success. I mean, I will say that I think there's some value to a first touch, because if you're wanting to know where most of your leads are coming from, where they initially found out about you, and you have kind of a contact acquisition goal, then that can be really helpful. A first touch model can be really helpful for that. But yeah, like everything in between, it's really hard to judge that a single, this white paper download that I did just before the salesperson created the opportunity, like, should that get more credit than the white paper that I downloaded 2 weeks before that?
Yeah. And in some ways, like revenue teams are almost architecting that journey, or they should be, right? So they kind of are putting that picture together, like, sales is going to touch something before it becomes an opportunity, or or there's some
like
type
a demo before,
before. So it's almost like you would know what would get the credit, or you're almost like pushing those channels to actually get the credit. So it's not really telling you something that you don't really know already.
And
Yeah.
I think that's a very important thing to call out with and I think we've mentioned it on a podcast before, like order-based attribution models definitely have a big downside to them based on exactly what you said there, right? Order doesn't really matter. Like I think the example we gave was someone like engaged with an email or like downloaded a white paper from an email just after, as like a follow-up to them going to a breakfast with your CEO or something. But just because they downloaded that white paper the next day, in a W-shaped model, that's going to get 30% attribution if there's an opportunity created. But that is definitely the dinner with your CEO definitely influenced that opportunity a lot more. So until these vendors are able to enable us to, and this could even be more complicated than it's worth, but it enable us to be able to give additional weight based on the type of touch point, then it's good. I think these W-shaped models and that you like any of these kind of uneven spread models are going to probably have more issues than they do solutions and improvements.
Yeah. One thing I like about, go ahead, Alison.
I was just going to say one thing, even with the even spread model, like when you start looking at some of those dimensions I mentioned, like win rate and velocity, is you can start to look at that data. And if you do see trends, feed that back into your model and weight those things more. And then your weighted model becomes more accurate over time. So you can always use the data to then not just improve your marketing efforts, but make your model more accurate over time.
Well, that's where like machine learning and AI comes in. What are your thoughts there? Is that the future, or is that you probably need a lot of volume for that as well? Back to your point earlier.
Yeah.
Or is it all hype?
I have skepticism about it because like a lot of the companies we work with are B2B companies. We're not like Amazon, where you have thousands and like millions of transactions where you can really discern a pattern. So I have some skepticism about it, but I definitely want someone to prove me wrong, because it does seem like that's the best. That would be the best way if you had a machine learning model that really was able to discern, okay, if you do these things in this order, that's your golden path to success.
I like how you said that. Skepticism, but you want to be proven wrong. I like that.
I think the one final thing, I think a lot of the time the argument against attribution is like using common sense. And I think one thing we've proved here is that is a key part to doing attribution.
Yeah, you still need common sense.
You still need common sense. But it doesn't mean that you just go based purely on blind common sense alone. And
it informs your common sense to help you improve.
Like that's the whole thing. To improve, you are using your brain, you're making decisions, you're comparing. It's less black and white than just looking at a report on a dashboard, one report, and taking a lot of things into consideration. So yes, all the people that say you need common sense, we agree with you, right? Like and
that's where the story comes in, right?
Yeah.
Like we find that one of the big differentiators for a marketing operations person to go from like good to great is having that analytics experience and then being able to tell a story with that data to their CMO and help them understand it.
Yeah.
Right. And that takes a lot of interpretation, understanding, analysis, common sense, understanding your business and all of the above. So attribution is never just going to show you the thing to do ever. No. You're still going to use your human brain.
Yeah.
Any final things to say, Alison, or anything else you want to add on attribution? If someone's been listening to this and they want to get started, like what's a good place for them to start and learn, or any resources or anything like that? Like, how did you learn all of this? I know it's probably a lot of learn by doing, but any advice you could give to the budding analytics masters out there?
Yeah, I mean, definitely start by dissecting a couple of really important deals and looking at the journey people took. You don't even have to have software to do it. You can just look at even in Marketo, what did the people on this opportunity do, and what led them to the purchase, and kind of then think about that more, like I said, more broadly. Is that same pattern or the same kinds of touches influencing other deals? I mean, the way I learned, I actually worked for one of the attribution vendors and got to see how a lot of customers use the data, and learned a lot from my customers, and learned a lot just from implementing the software and seeing where it could go wrong. So it's a great way to learn is really get in with a vendor. But yeah.
So if you want to learn, ping Alison, and maybe she can try and get you a job at one of her old employer, and you can go through dozens of implementations, and you're sure going to learn a lot from that. Awesome. All right, I think it's time to wrap it up, right?
Yeah. So thanks everyone for joining on today's episode. If you like this episode, or if you know someone who is looking for a better way to do attribution, or even within your organization, definitely share this episode. And thanks again, Alison, for joining us. We'll see you on the next episode of Forward Thinking. Have a good one, everyone.